The smile that hid a railway problem. Everyone knows the cheerful blue engine with the bright eyes and the confident smile. For generations, children have grown up believing in the promise of being a really useful engine. The message was simple: work hard, be kind, prove your worth, and you will find your place in the world. But what if the real story behind that smiling locomotive isn't cheerful at all? What if the engine that inspired the world's most famous fictional train was never truly considered successful? What if, behind the paint and personality, lies a story of compromise, mechanical frustration, and quiet disappointment? To understand the truth, we have to step away from the island of Sodier and return to early 20th century Britain. Because Thomas the Tank Engine was based on a very real locomotive, the LB&SCR E2 class. And the E2's story is far more complicated than most people realize. By the early 1900s, British railways were under immense strain. Industrial growth had changed everything. Trains were longer. Freight loads were heavier. Passenger expectations were rising. Older locomotives, once considered reliable workhorses, were beginning to struggle. Among them was the Stroud E1 class. When introduced in the late 19th century, they were excellent at short-distance goods work and yard duties. They were agile, capable, and well-suited to the railway demands of their time. But time does not stand still. As trains became heavier and routes busier, the E1 engines began to show their age. They weren't broken. They weren't poorly built. They simply weren't powerful enough anymore. Railway management faced a decision: rebuild the old engines, or design something entirely new. The first approach came from a superintendent who believed strongly in rebuilding and recycling locomotives rather than scrapping them. One prototype rebuild was created, essentially a strengthened version of the E1, and it showed promise. But leadership changed. And with that change came a new philosophy. Instead of rebuilding the past, the railway would build something new. That something new became the E2 class. On paper, the E2 looked like progress. It was an 060 tank engine, 6 driving wheels, compact, powerful, designed for freight and shunting duties. It carried more boiler pressure than its predecessors. It had updated components. It appeared modern. When the first 5 units entered service in 1913, expectations were cautiously optimistic. They were stronger than the E1s. That much was undeniable. They could pull heavier trains. They accelerated with authority. They looked solid and purposeful. For a moment, it seemed like the railway had made the right decision. But railways are unforgiving environments. Minor flaws quickly become major frustrations. And the E2's problems began to surface almost immediately. Steam engines survive on 2 essential things: coal and water. Without enough of either, they are useless. One of the first criticisms leveled at the E2 was its water capacity. Despite being a more powerful engine, its tanks were not significantly larger than those of the older E1s. This meant that while the E2 could pull heavier loads, it couldn't sustain those efforts for very long. On short yard runs, that limitation wasn't catastrophic. But on repeated trips between stations, especially on busy suburban routes, it became a logistical headache. Crews had to stop more often to refill. Schedules became harder to maintain. Efficiency suffered. Later versions of the E2 attempted to address this by extending the side tanks, increasing water capacity slightly. But the increase was modest, not transformative. The flaw wasn't eliminated. It was merely reduced. If the water capacity was frustrating, the coal bunker added another layer of difficulty. The E2's bunker was found to be somewhat undersized for the tasks it was expected to perform. For continuous operations, especially on demanding routes, crews found themselves managing fuel consumption carefully. Longer duties meant planning refueling points precisely. In a high-pressure railway environment, these details mattered. An engine that cannot sustain its workload becomes a burden. And burden is not a word any railway wants associated with its new locomotives. Then came something harder to quantify, but impossible to ignore: The E2 had a tendency to oscillate during acceleration. In simple terms, it shook. When pulling away from stations or signals, crews reported noticeable vibration. At higher speeds, stability wasn't its strongest quality either. Steam locomotives were never smooth like modern trains. But the E2's motion stood out enough to draw complaints. Confidence in machinery is critical. When engineers and drivers feel uneasy, word spreads quickly. And the E2 began earning a reputation, not as dangerous, not as catastrophic, but as awkward. Not refined. Not elegant. Just average. There was another, more dramatic problem. Some early reports described the E2 as having a tendency to throw sparks and occasional bursts of fire from the firebox area. In steam operation, sparks were not unheard of. But excessive flare-ups were unsettling. In heavily trafficked areas, especially near urban environments, fire hazards were taken seriously. Whether exaggerated or not, the stories added to the locomotive's growing reputation problem. The E2 wasn't a disaster. But it wasn't inspiring confidence either. Railways are practical institutions. If a locomotive struggles in one role, it gets reassigned. And that is exactly what happened. Rather than serving as versatile replacements for older engines across varied routes, the E2s were increasingly pushed toward yard shunting and localized goods duties. Tasks that required strength. But not endurance. Short bursts of work. Not sustained travel. In those conditions, the E2 could perform adequately. It could move heavy wagons around yards. It could handle freight rearrangements. It could do the job. But being able to do the job is different from being celebrated. And certainly different from being legendary. Here lies the beginning of the great irony. In children's stories, Thomas is praised for striving to be really useful. He competes with larger engines. He proves his value. He earns respect. But the real locomotive that inspired him spent much of its life being carefully assigned to roles that minimized its weaknesses. The E2 was not the pride of the railway. It was not the future of steam design. It was not revolutionary. It was serviceable. And sometimes, merely serviceable isn't enough to leave a mark. Once an engine develops a reputation, it is hard to shake. The E2's image among railway crews settled into a middle ground. It wasn't hated. It wasn't adored. It was tolerated. Useful in specific circumstances. Limited in others. And railway history is filled with locomotives like that, machines that did their jobs without glamour. Machines that kept freight moving but never became icons. No one in 1913 could have predicted that this particular class, modest, flawed, somewhat constrained, would one day become the face of a global children's franchise. At the time, it was simply another attempt at modernization. Another design in the long evolution of steam power. By the end of its early service years, the pattern was clear. The E2 had strength, but limited range. It had pulling power, but limited flexibility. It had potential, but never fully realized it. And in the unforgiving arithmetic of railway economics, that meant it would never dominate mainline work. It would never be the star. It would remain in the background. A supporting character. Almost forgotten. Almost. Because history had one more twist waiting. And that twist would transform an annoyingly average locomotive into one of the most recognizable machines on Earth. But that transformation wouldn't happen because of engineering success. It would happen because of storytelling. And in the next chapter, we'll see how a flawed dockyard engine, pushed to the margins of railway glory, found unexpected redemption in fiction. By the time the E2 locomotives settled into service, railway planners had already begun adjusting expectations. The engines weren't disasters. They weren't mechanical failures. But they weren't the flexible, all-purpose workhorses the railway desperately needed either. And one design feature ensured they would never be. The wheelbase. At first glance, the E2's 6 driving wheels seemed typical for a tank engine. Many locomotives used similar arrangements. But the spacing between those wheels, combined with the rigid frame, created a serious operational limitation. Rail yards are chaotic environments. Tracks twist into sharp curves. Sidings branch at awkward angles. Space is tight, especially in urban terminals built decades earlier when trains were smaller. Engines assigned to shunting duties must be nimble. They must navigate tight turns, reverse repeatedly, and operate in confined spaces without difficulty. The E2 struggled with this. Its long, rigid wheelbase made certain curves impossible to negotiate safely. In some yards, drivers discovered entire sections of track were effectively off-limits. Imagine assigning a supposedly modern locomotive to shunting duty, only to discover it physically cannot access parts of the yard it's meant to serve. Dispatchers had to plan movements around the engine's limitations. Other locomotives were sometimes required to complete tasks the E2 could not. Efficiency suffered. Frustration grew. And slowly, quietly, the E2 became known as the engine that didn't quite fit anywhere. Railways don't abandon investments easily. Locomotives are expensive machines, expected to serve for decades. So instead of withdrawing the E2s, management searched for roles better suited to their strengths. Piloting duties at major stations became one option. These tasks involved moving trains short distances, positioning carriages, and assisting larger engines. The work required strength, something the E2 had, but not long-distance endurance or extreme maneuverability. For a time, this role suited them. But even here, they remained overshadowed by other classes better designed for versatility. The E2 existed in a strange middle ground. Too specialized for some jobs. Not specialized enough for others. Useful, but rarely indispensable. History sometimes forces unexpected changes. During the general strike of 1926, railway operations across Britain were disrupted. Staff shortages and logistical chaos required improvisation. Engines that normally handled freight found themselves pulling passenger trains. The E2 briefly returned to duties it had not been designed to perform. It managed, proving once again that it wasn't incapable. But this moment was temporary. Once normal operations resumed, the engines returned to their familiar supporting roles. It was another example of the E2's defining characteristic. Adequate. Never exceptional. After railway grouping reorganized Britain's rail network, the E2s became part of the Southern Railway system. New management evaluated existing locomotive classes, deciding which designs deserved further development. Some engines were clear successes and inspired future improvements. Others were quietly phased out. The E2 fell somewhere in between. Engineers recognized that the design had merit, particularly its power for its size. Studies were even initiated to explore improved versions that could replace older pre-grouping locomotives. On paper, the idea made sense. Refine the flaws. Increase capacity. Adjust the wheelbase. Create a truly versatile tank engine. But plans require funding. And funding was limited. Economic constraints forced the cancellation of the project before any improved design could be built. Once again, the E2's story became one of missed potential. From that point forward, the E2s settled into routine work. Shunting. Goods movements. Station duties. Uncelebrated tasks that kept the railway functioning but rarely attracted attention. If steam locomotives were actors on a stage, the E2s were the background performers, essential to the scene but rarely in the spotlight. For railway enthusiasts, they were interesting curiosities. For crews, they were simply tools. For history, they were nearly forgettable. Nearly. The turning point came not on main lines or passenger routes, but at the docks of Southampton. Dockyards are unlike traditional rail environments. Tracks are more open. Curves are broader. Loads are heavy but movements are short and repetitive. Here, the E2's strengths aligned perfectly with operational needs. Its power allowed it to move heavy cargo wagons with ease. Its limited range didn't matter, refueling points were nearby. Its rigidity was less of an issue on spacious dock tracks. For the first time in their careers, the E2 locomotives felt perfectly matched to their environment. Crews who had once viewed them with indifference began to appreciate them. They were reliable, predictable, strong. At Southampton, the engines that struggled elsewhere became genuinely useful. But history had one more change waiting, a change that would end the age of steam entirely. By the mid-20th century, diesel locomotives were transforming rail transport. They required less maintenance. They could operate longer without refueling. They eliminated the need for constant water supplies. And they offered consistent performance regardless of terrain or duty cycle. For steam engines like the E2, this technological shift was devastating. No matter how well they performed at the docks, they represented an outdated system. Diesel shunters, particularly classes designed specifically for dock work, began replacing steam locomotives across Britain. At Southampton, the transition was inevitable. One by one, the E2 engines were withdrawn from service. There were no preservation plans. No recognition of historical significance. They were simply obsolete machines reaching the end of their operational lives. By 1963, the last E2 locomotive had been scrapped. Not a single example survived. No museum display. No heritage railway operation. No preserved engine for future generations to study. The class vanished completely. And with it disappeared the real-world foundation of what would become one of the most beloved characters in children's entertainment. The irony is profound. Millions of people around the world recognize Thomas the Tank Engine instantly. But the locomotive that inspired him no longer exists in physical form. The cheerful blue engine lives on. The real machine is gone. By the time steam faded from Britain's railways, the E2 had already slipped into obscurity. It wasn't remembered as a failure. It wasn't celebrated as a triumph. It was simply part of the past. A practical solution to a specific problem in a specific era. Nothing more. Or so it seemed. Because history sometimes preserves machines not through steel and rivets, but through stories. And the next part of this journey reveals how an overlooked dockyard engine found unexpected immortality in the imagination of a writer. If the story ended with the scrapping of the E2 class, it would be a footnote in railway history. A modest locomotive, useful in places, limited in others, eventually replaced by better technology. But history took an unexpected turn, not in workshops or rail yards, but in a child's bedroom. The man responsible was Wilbert Awdry, a railway enthusiast and storyteller who believed trains had personalities. When his young son fell ill, Awdry began telling bedtime stories about talking locomotives to comfort him. These stories grew into a series of books known as the Railway series. And among the characters he imagined was a small tank engine who wanted to prove himself. Awdry's original vision for this character was not based on the E2 at all. He had another locomotive type in mind, one he believed better represented a capable, hard-working tank engine. But Awdry was a writer, not an illustrator. When it came time to publish the stories, an artist was hired to bring the characters to life visually. And that is where everything changed. When the illustrator produced the first drawings of Thomas, the engine resembled the E2 class. Whether intentional or accidental, the design stuck. Once printed, distributed, and loved by children, it could not be undone. Thomas had become an E2, visually, at least. A locomotive that had struggled to find its place in reality suddenly found a perfect role in fiction. In stories, Thomas was brave, determined, reliable. Everything the real E2 had only partially achieved. Fiction transformed an average engine into an extraordinary one. Perhaps the reason Thomas became so beloved lies precisely in this contrast. He wasn't the biggest engine. He wasn't the fastest. He wasn't the strongest. He was the underdog. A small engine trying to prove his worth among giants. Children understood that struggle instinctively. Adults recognized it too. The character's appeal wasn't perfection, it was perseverance. And unknowingly, that mirrored the real E2's story. A machine that kept working despite limitations. A locomotive that found its niche after years of misalignment. As the stories gained popularity, Thomas expanded beyond books. Television adaptations introduced him to new generations worldwide. Merchandise followed. Toys, clothing, theme parks, and films turned the character into a global phenomenon. The smiling blue engine became one of the most recognizable fictional vehicles ever created. Yet few fans knew, or were told, about the real locomotive behind the character. The flawed dockyard shunter. The engine that never became a star in its own lifetime. Stories have the ability to reshape reality. They can elevate overlooked figures. They can preserve what history forgets. Without the railway series, the E2 class would be known only to railway historians and enthusiasts. Instead, its likeness lives on in a form more enduring than steel. A fictional engine traveling an imaginary island, powered by imagination rather than steam. There is something poetic about the transformation. A locomotive that struggled to meet expectations became the foundation for a character who inspires millions to believe in themselves. A machine scrapped without ceremony became immortal through storytelling. The real engine was average. The fictional one became extraordinary. And perhaps that is the deepest truth behind the smiling face. Greatness isn't always about perfection. Sometimes it's about how a story chooses to remember you. So the next time you see Thomas the Tank Engine, remember the journey hidden beneath the paint. Remember the dockyards, the limitations, the quiet service. Remember the engine that didn't quite fit, until fiction gave it a place where it belonged. Because behind every legend, there is a forgotten history waiting to be rediscovered.